Hi guys. Okay, today we're going to talk about the history of the percussion revolver. And I want to give you a little context of where this revolver falls in history. And to really understand its impact, its development, you've got to understand a little bit of the history of what's going on right now. In the 1820s, early 1820s, a gentleman brought forth this system of ignition called the percussion cap. Now before this, for like 200 to 300 years before this, had been flintlock ignition, had been the predominant method. And there had been other ideas floated along, but this was the first time a new system stuck and began to grow. This made it for a cap with a fulminate mercury pellet inside of it to fit onto a nipple, a hammer hit it, it ignites, bang. It was a lot more weather resistant than a flintlock. You could carry caps, etc. This opened up a door. Now prior to this, for self-defense, most people, if they could afford a gun, which was not a common thing, because a small gun was very, very expensive. It's actually harder to make a small gun than it is to make a big gun, because yes, there are less resources in it, but to make those small parts, the small springs and all of the metallurgy of the day, was much more difficult and time consuming and a much higher failure rate. So a gunsmith could probably make 3 full-size rifles in the time it took to make one fancy dueling pistol or personal defense pistol. Now you see a lot of military surplus pistols of this day in the early 1820s and 30s that are actually old military guns that are getting in the field. But even then, the average person could not afford such a luxury. Okay? So what did the average person do for self-defense? Well, ground one was fists. Ground two was some sort of edge weapon. Now this guy that became famous, it was actually his brother, Resin Bowie, who got the idea of taking a knife and putting a cross guard on it, like the old knives that were used in war back in the medieval days, because he'd been fighting a Creek Indian or a Choctaw, it was said, and in the middle of this fight, fighting with a butcher knife, his hand slid down the blade. Because of that, he put a cross guard on it and he changed the design. Well, something that was sweeping America and most of the world at this time was the idea of dueling. Okay, we had several presidents, like Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, who had fought duels. There were a lot of people in well-to-do positions that fought duels. This is where you felt like your honor had been impurged, and you would have the other person under a very strict set of rules. You would meet at a certain place, and you would, fight with the desired weapons of either swords. Yes, they were still using swords in the 1820s and 30s for this. Knives, guns, rifles, shotguns, explosive barrels, all kinds of things were used in it. It was half spectacle. But that was the mindset of the people of that day. And when Bowie, Jim Bowie, the younger brother of Resin Bowie, who had come up with that knife, went to national prominence where he had used a knife in a botched duel between 2 other people, and he had managed to take out multiple opponents with this big Bowie knife. The Bowie knife became the dueling weapon of tour de force. And so many people walked around with a fancy dueling knife stuck on their side. It was carried in such a way to be very prominent, to show that I am someone not to be messed with. I have this. You see a lot of coffin handles. That indicated it was a dueling weapon and that you weren't to be messed with. I'll kill you, type deal. So when Colt came into this, and he came up with the idea of this revolving cylinder gun that indexed automatically and locked into position. That was innovation. We had other guns, but they were manually rotated at this time. But the average person was only carrying a knife for self-defense. So any gun just about beats a knife for self-defense because I can shoot you at range versus having to get up close with a knife. Because of that, Colt's innovation really caught on, but not like you would think, because his first guns were the Pattersons. And we think today of the Patterson gun, and I'll put a picture of one right here. The Patterson was just really a prototype. You know, yes, it went into production, but the design needed some work, and Colt had come up with it, but it was too complex. There was too many moving parts, too many parts that could get out of proper function too easily. Fouling could get down into it very easily and jam or rust the gun up. It just was really, today we'd call it a prototype. You know, that it needs some more refining before going into production. And Colt made multiple styles of this. We think of like the one I just showed you, but actually they were a lot. This was a family. There was a little bitty small 28 caliber small ones, pocket models. And then there was revolving shotguns and rifles that used the same basic design. And it was not a commercial success. Many times it was said that only Colt himself could make the guns time to work properly. And so that caused a detriment, and Colt went out of business. And then some Texas Rangers armed with the Percussion Revolvers, like the one I just showed you, engaged a group of Indians. And the Indians used the tactics of that day. It was a large group, about 80 of them versus like 7, 8, something like that of the Rangers. And the older guys would kind of hold back a little bit and let the younger hot blood try to, you know, rush in and goad them and get the guys to shoot their single shot rifles. Well, as soon as they shot their single shot rifles, everybody would pounce on them because they knew it took too long to reload. But they weren't armed with those rifles. They weren't armed with single shot pistols. They were armed with Pattersons. And that made each man in each hand had the equivalent of 5 guns for that day. That made one man the equal of a squad in the infantry. And so they were able to engage and disproportionately take out the Indians. Because of this, it really cemented in the ideas of one of those members, Captain Walker, that we needed such a weapon for military use. And so he sought out and he found Colt again. And through political backing of Walker, they designed a gun together, making improvements. Now, really, guys, and I did this in my Walker video that I talked earlier. You look at the Walker and it's a carbine, a one-handed carbine, okay? Here's a picture of a Percussion revolving rifle. Now here's a picture of a Walker. Doesn't that look like you just pistol gripped off a short carbine of that rifle? It would be much like today you have a pistol grip on a pump shotgun. You know, no stock, just what we call a cruiser. They wanted a weapon that they could engage in combat from horseback or from close proximity and have the power of a carbine in a handgun. That's where they were going. And it made Colt profitable. He was smart enough to set up, because of this, to put him back into position. But where is he going? There's a limited amount that these big, heavy military guns can go, because at that time you had the mounted rifles and you had the cavalry. That's it. 1,000 guns. And then they created the rest of the going on Dragoons. They stayed in production. But what's happening? This is 47 was the Walker. He real quickly brought out something the size of that little small pocket Patterson. in 31 caliber, which is a caliber he'd had before, about the size of that pocket Patterson that he'd had. And we call that the baby Dragoon. And here's a picture of it now. This was a 31 caliber small pocket pistol. Again, even at this time, the average defensive weapon was a knife. So having a pistol, 5 shots, gave you the equivalent of 5 guns in one. You could threaten off your attacker. Now from power-wise, these are not very powerful, and they're kind of like what we'd think of like a 22 long rifle today. But the object of the game here was, I could pull this out, and who wants a bellyache? Because these little projectiles are so small. If I shoot you for the medical of the day, they're probably not going to be able to find the bullet once it goes into an abdomen or something like that, which means you're going to die in a week of lead poisoning, or you're going to die from the fact that it's lubricated with 3-month-old bear grease or bacon grease. The biological, there is no penicillin. There ain't no doctor that can cure this easily. So think of it like a biological weapon. If I shoot you, yes, you're going to survive right now, but there's a very good odds that in a week or less you're going to die horribly. So that's what commanded respect for that little gun. So you had the Walker, and all those guns are progressing, but Colt is focusing on the civilian market, and he brought out that little baby Dragoon using the lock work like he had on the Walker. And this had not bore fruit like he wanted. Then in 49, 48 and 49, what's happening out west? California gold rush. A Colt gun is being bought on the East Coast for $12, $14 and being sold for $500 on the West Coast. Yeah, Colt is in the right place at the right time. And he starts making improvements. And so you go from the Baby Dragoon to the Wells Fargo model, and then he comes out with this. Now this is a 48 pocket model. 49. Now this, sorry for the aircraft guys. Now this is where Colt is still staying with a 31 caliber, but he's refining the action. So he's still up here making these big, powerful, you know, Dragoons and the Walkers and stuff, but here he's changing. He's now gone to the, instead of the round, to the elongated stops. The lock work in here is what would become, as we know it, the Colt lock work. The hand, the bolt, everything is right here. The loading lever. This is the pattern for the later guns. You see how it's now got the round trigger guard instead of that hooked back trigger guard, which was good for hooking into a sash with that hook. This one is carried more in a pocket, etc. And so the 49 pocket model is where Colt refined the action. All those parts, which had been scaled down from the Walker to form the Baby Dragoon and that, now he's had time and money to refine it. And we get this action, which has all the parts, the elongated stop, and etc. Now from this design, he scales it up. A lot of people think they scale it down, but actually this came first. And so he scaled it up to make the 51. This is the size of the Patterson, the big Patterson that was a 36. But now he's taken this action and scaled it up to create the 50 and 51 Navy. So this came first, then this. And this is going to lay the groundwork for the rest of the run, because with the 49, this was the #1 seller of all the Colts. Hundreds of thousands, I think it's 200,000 or 300,000 of these small pocket models. It was by far, if you were going to encounter a Colt pistol on the frontier, odds are it was going to be one of these, because this is a personal defense gun. The climate has changed by 1850, where in the 1830s Knives, now it's moved up to a pistol. Pepper boxes are common. 5 shots. You got to turn and reload it. But the Colt, being the fact that it was repeatable fire, bang, 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 gives them a distinct advantage. So there's many people that want to copy Colt's design, etc. Colt brought out the 51 to be like his big Patterson. It's got all the improvements. It's got the proper lock work now. It's got the improved loading lever. It's got the tapered smooth look. So this is the refinement of what the Patterson and this lock work became. Now from this, Colt would go back to this and want to go up on the caliber. So what he's going to do is he's going to make the cylinder a little bit bigger, make the hole inside the barrel a little bit bigger, and take it up to a 36 caliber, the same as this. Cut the bottom of the frame right here to make room for that fatter donut on the front of the cylinder. And there you have the Pocket Navy and the Pocket Police. That also was the basic idea of where he took this gun, because now he's got the Walkers as turned into the Dragoons. Same action, scaled up. So you've got 36 caliber here and the big 44 Dragoon here. Can I get this firepower in something more this size? So they took, and there's one prototype where they took a 51 Navy, bored it out to 44 caliber, made a fat ring cylinder like I'm talking about, and made it 44 caliber. That became the 1860 Army, which is the Dragoon line and this line coming together to form that gun. That gun was to replace the Dragoons in actual field combat, and it became the big brother for this, which is the belt gun. Okay, this was not meant for the average person to carry on a belt. Basically, the average person would carry, even to the end, something like this was a self-defense weapon. This was more like a weapon of war or something like law enforcement. This is serious. Okay, much like today in modern times, you would have people who carry a handgun for personal defense, but would carry a bigger carbine like an AR in like a law enforcement role or in a security role. Well, this was like the AR. It was the bigger, we're serious now, more prevalent thing. And then the Army 60, again, same preference. That's the mindset. I want to give you a little bit of context there of how these guns and what position that these percussion revolvers fit in. By the end of the Civil War, it's already obvious that cartridge guns are the way to go. It was only due to the fact that Roland White had the through patent that went to Smith & Wesson. And Smith & Wesson didn't produce a percussion revolver. They produced a cartridge revolver, a 22 caliber, really small, something equivalent like this size as a 22 caliber pocket revolver for self-defense. Many officers in the Civil War carried it because, again, self-defense was point blank. Okay? Not a weapon of war, it was a method of self-defense. Knives were still considered a primary source of self-defense. The gun was just the next step up. By the end of the war, many of the guns started being converted over to cartridges by gunsmiths and later by the factories themselves once they could get around that Roland White patent and extinguish. So the percussion revolvers hung in there. Many of these little 31s were converted over to 32 rimfire or some 32 small cartridge. And so the 32 was still considered the self-defense gun. All the way up into the mid 1900s, you still had a lot of old guys that had 32 automatics, 32 revolvers. It was still a popular seller because the 32 was the self-defense gun. The 38 was the duty gun, the police gun, the we're getting serious gun. And then the 45 was a gun of war. That mindset, you see, is still progressing all the way into modern times. So, in conclusion, The mindset of the day when Colt came on the scene was the idea of coming up with an economical self-defense weapon that he could market, because so many people needed a self-defense weapon, especially in the western migration and all these rowdy cow towns and everything else. You're still going to have your rifles and all for hunting, for war, for fighting off, you know, Indians and things like that, but that personal weapon was a knife, and he went and substituted and made up a gun that could do the job better, more efficiently, and at a price the average person can afford. That's where the percussion revolver fits into this puzzle of time. Hope this clears up some questions for you guys. Please leave any questions or comments below. As always, thank you for supporting my channel. Till next time, I'm Blackie for Shaman's Forge, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.